Okay.
Hopefully she'll be back.
Yeah, all right. So thank you everyone for being here today. I am Hana Shams Ahmed from Bangladesh, and I'm an Asia 21 alumni from 2008, currently doing a PhD at York University in Canada, and I'll be moderating this session. Thank you for joining us today for this panel on digital security issues in South Asia in the era of pandemic. I also want to thank Asia 21 for providing us with this platform, especially Sanjeev and Tenzin, who has given us a lot of support day and night, literally, over the last couple of weeks. So today we're going to have a discussion about the ongoing global pandemic and how it has opened up digital communication spaces to unprecedented levels, and what this basically means for security and privacy for individuals and communities. Now, as we all know, as a result of the expansion of digital spaces, a number of educational and professional activities have now moved partially or fully to online virtual spaces. The technological advances in the last few decades have enabled the volume and capacity of this engagement in these spaces. But in the era of global digital surveillance, it has also brought about new threats to the privacy of individuals and communities. In South Asia, where repressive governments and draconian laws prevent freedom of speech of individuals, and where individuals have been threatened and incarcerated by the state for their speech, the question may well be asked, what does this relocation to digital spaces mean for the safety and security of people? And will human freedom be a collateral casualty of the pandemic? In addition to state-sanctioned obstructions on freedom of speech, various forms of harassment, including stalking, trolling, hate speech, and online mobbing, pose a serious threat to individuals' safety and security online, especially in the face of impunity of perpetrators within weak justice systems. Citizens are therefore caught in a double bind. They find themselves increasingly vulnerable both to new and virulent forms of oppression from private actors seeking relief, which then empowers the government to be more authoritarian. So in this discussion, we'll explore the opportunities and threats and discuss how civil society in South Asia can protect the right to freedom of expression in this region with the expansion of digital spaces in this quote-unquote new normal. So, and to discuss these issues, we have on the panel Asia 21 alumni members who have been working on various aspects surrounding these issues for quite a long time. We have with us Shankar Narayan, who is the co-founder and co-principal of MIRA, Mobilize Innovation Reimagine Agency. Shankar is based in Seattle and was previously the Technology and Liberty Project Director at the ACLU of Washington. We also have with us Sara Hossain, who is a partner at Dr. Kamal Hossein and Associates from Bangladesh. She's a barrister practicing at the Supreme Court of Bangladesh, mainly in the area of constitutional public interest and family law. We also have Nighat Dad, who is the founder of Digital Rights Foundation in Pakistan. Nighat has played a pivotal role in defining the cyberspace narrative in the country that and has been at the forefront of Pakistani feminist movements. And we also have with us Nikhil Pahwa, who is the founder of MEDIANAMA in India, which is a leading publication chronicling the evolution of digital policy in India. Unfortunately, Zafar Sobhan, who was supposed to be here, the editor of Dhaka Tribune, he's not with us today and sends his regrets. I'll first do a round of questions with our panelists and then open the floor for questions from the audience. If we have more time, I will then do another round of questions to our panelists. To the audience, I just want to say, please feel free to introduce yourself and send your questions whenever you want in the chat function. And if your question is aimed at a particular panelist, please do mention their name and we will try our best to respond to as many questions as possible. So, without further ado, I would like to begin the conversation first with Shankar. Shankar, you've been working on issues of privacy, surveillance, and artificial intelligence from a social justice point of view. Can you please speak to us on issues of fairness, transparency, and accountability regarding surveillance and AI technologies? And what are the specific concerns during a pandemic where so much of people's work have moved online and so much of our data is being shared over the internet? Over to you, Shankar.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. And thank you for having me on this panel. It's an honor to be with such a distinguished set of experts. I think my role on this panel is essentially to give a little bit of comparative perspective and lessons learned maybe from the US experience that can transfer over to South Asia in a very, very limited time. So, I think the thing that I would say just as a sort of foundational concept to understand as you're analyzing this is the term surveillance capitalism, because that's the field in which all of this really plays out, right? And I think boiled down to its essence, what surveillance capitalism is this idea of both public and private sector data collection and surveillance that enables this widespread commodification of data about people, right? And often creates a situation in which those people have little or no agency over how the data is used. And it goes on to impact their lives in various ways, whether it's reappropriated or misappropriated by government actors or by private actors, whether it feeds unaccountable AI systems that people have little transparency into, let alone actual control over, whether it's used by corporate actors, etc. And I would emphasize maybe a handful of things about the phenomenon of surveillance capitalism. First of all, it's not really a new thing, right? Even though it's supercharged now in our era of, as you say, Hannah, people's lives moving online. It's been around for a really long time, right? It's historic. And the fact is that technology and the data feeding technology have for a very long time disproportionately impacted communities with less power in a given society, right? Whether it's the United States, whether it's South Asia. I always give this good historic example, which happened in the US of the Hollerith machines, right? These were machines that were originally intended to be used for the census in the United States, right? In the early 1900s, that were ultimately repurposed to fuel the Japanese-American incarceration, right? So because they had this really efficient census tool or technology, they were able to easily repurpose it to round up Japanese Americans and make it very, very difficult for them to escape being rounded up. And you can see, the threads of that experience extending all the way to things happening in South Asia now, right, around Aadhaar and the various biometrics connected to it that I'm sure other speakers will get into. It's also important, I think, to appreciate that this phenomenon often blurs the lines between public and private surveillance and enables this kind of surveillance to actually skirt existing rules, right? So, for example, in the US, a jurisdiction like Seattle, where I live, thanks to a lot of organizing efforts here, has adopted really stringent rules around government surveillance. But what happens then is that private entities in this space can essentially have the voluntary adoption of their technologies by private entities and make that data available, for example, to law enforcement through a backdoor. Amazon's Ring data collection system, which is an electronic doorbell connected to facial recognition, is a great example of that, right? It's private surveillance that has a backdoor to government entities that they can then access and possibly reappropriate information for purposes that adopter never actually intended that it would be used for. And I think the third thing to appreciate is this space has very little regulation and transparency right now, which means that data is now driving these often unfair and unaccountable AI systems that are in far more places, I think, than people generally realize. And very briefly, to kind of address your question about the pandemic, I think what that's done is take these existing inequities in our brick and mortar systems and actually supercharge them. Those without digital access are even more cut off from the economy. There are more spaces of forced data collection, such as, for example, through contact tracing apps. And the companies that power the phenomenon of all of this data-driven connection between people actually have consolidated their power over our data to the extent that it's become even more difficult than it previously was to exert meaningful regulatory control. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Shankar. You brought up some very important points about surveillance capitalism and how it has actually been around for many years. It's not anything recent, and how it blurs the line between the public and the private. And I will now go on to Sara. Sara, you've done a lot of work around the Digital Security Act in Bangladesh. Can you tell us a little bit about what are some of the concerns being experienced specifically during the pandemic in Bangladesh, but also perhaps across South Asia regarding the framing or use of laws relating to surveillance of digital spaces and of speech?
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. Maybe if I could just say a word about what I just heard from Shankar about this interesting thing about the data for the census. In Bangladesh also, the voter ID cards were actually what kind of fueled the consolidation of personal data. And at the time that happened, about 10 years ago, when we'd gone through a period of not being able to have elections, having a huge popular movement for elections, the fact that personal information was taken for those ID cards wasn't questioned at all, because there was such a sense of, positive outcome with having the voter IDs finally and having the election going forward with the proper voter list. So we kind of started off with a very, very uncritical perspective, and we haven't really had the kind of debates that have happened in India around the Aadhaar card, for example, around privacy and security. There's just been a kind of very a sort of silver plate handed over saying, okay, whatever, do more. And I think also because of the very strong development, partly because of the sort of democratic deficit in Bangladesh, which means that we don't have these kinds of discussions around accountability and so on in a political space. But we also have a very overwhelming development discourse here. And it means that the success in that sense of using the voter cards also has gone into now this discussion around using smart cards for accessing all kinds of services and so on, again, very uncritically in terms of the risks. So that, I just want to mention that, because when you connect that with the kind of regulatory framework we have, or we don't have in terms of protections, combined with the very draconian legislation we have in the form of the Digital Insecurity Act, which really fuels human insecurity in a massive way, because the way in which on the one hand, we have these kind of sophisticated systems for gathering data, consolidating data. We have no sophisticated systems in terms of protecting data. Even in terms of the legal framework we have a nod to the requirement for data protection in the Digital Security Act, but we have no architecture in place to ensure that happens. And most critically, I think we don't have robust, independent systems to ensure that there can be any kind of protection. So that's a very lethal combination when you put it together. And the other aspect, I think the reason I keep saying that many of us call it the Digital Insecurity Act now, is because the way in which that legislation has been used effectively has been really to shut down criticism, commentary, political debate, even things that are not even political debate, but just in the realm of what you would understand as fair comment. And particularly that the spaces where it's been used the most is to cut down any kind of comment on political leaders. And sometimes family members as well. And anything that's considered to be, that we have this extraordinary phrase in the law called hurting the image of the nation. It's incredibly broad, as you can imagine. And unfortunately, the person who gets to define what is the image of the nation is the police constable who can make the arrest in the middle of the night without a warrant. So there's incredibly broad powers being given to law enforcing agencies, combined with the fact we don't have, as I said, strong accountability measures for when they misuse those powers. And just starting using my last minute, perhaps, to go back to your actual question, which is what has happened during the pandemic. What we have seen is the use of the Digital Security Act to arrest journalists, to arrest even a cartoonist who made a cartoon about some aspect of the COVID response and the possibility, I think, of there being VIP hospitals being mooted at one point as a response. And that cartoonist, after more than 6 months, I think, remains in jail under trial in an absurd allegation of having hurt the image of the nation. So perhaps that sort of sums up for you some of the more extreme risks that we can face with the Digital Security/Insecurity Act.
Thank you so much, Sara. Yeah, those are very important points, especially in terms of how many people are being incarcerated during COVID, and when people really require security much more. And what you raised about there being no discussions around accountability and the development discourse, which has been so uncritical in the country. I think those are very important points. And with that, I will move on from Bangladesh to Pakistan. So I'll move on to Nighat. Nighat, you have done a lot of work with women in Pakistan who have faced a lot of backlash and hate speech for exercising their rights in digital spaces. So can you perhaps talk a little bit about how women face discrimination in accessing digital spaces on the one hand, but also how women are harassed in these spaces when they do, make a space for themselves? What are some of the specific problems women in Pakistan are facing during the pandemic? If you could talk a little bit about that.
Right. So thank you so much, Hannah. I think it's very tempting to respond to what Sara has said because I can resonate so much that is happening in Pakistan with regards to the rules and the problematic and draconian laws that are emerging, regulating internet and online spaces. But coming to your question, I have been working around addressing the issue on equal and open online spaces for young women and girls in Pakistan for the last many years. And something that we have seen that their access to online spaces is already not really equal in the country where, internet penetration is low, but also like the patriarchal mindset and the conservative society really, doesn't allow them to access information and communication technologies the way, men can do, especially when it comes to far-flung areas or villages and towns. The kind of discrimination, or if we can name it, online violence against young women and girls, the forms that we see in Pakistan is hate speech, trolling, non-consensual use of their intimate images, sextortion, doxing. And I think it's important to note that during COVID, we have seen that, yes, there is a digital divide, but there is a massive gender digital divide exists in the country. And we have seen this issue were raised by the students who had to go back to their towns and villages where there was no internet, but they were supposed to come online and attend online classes. And we saw, especially in the conservative rural areas of Balochistan or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which are two provinces like more conservative than the other two provinces, men were protesting against the shutdown, like internet shutdowns or inaccessibility of internet. But women were not in those protests, but because at first place they were not allowed to step out of their homes and, be part of those protests. So, we see that the existing inequalities were actually multiplied by COVID. But one more trend that we noticed during COVID, that women journalists who were reporting on COVID and were very critical to the government's policies in terms of how they are responding to the pandemic. They were massively trolled, and that was like targeting trolling against some of the women journalists. So they took a step and wrote a statement and raised that issue. But it also says a lot where, you are journalist, but if you are a woman journalist, or if you are a woman human rights defender or a woman politician, the sexualized and gendered nature of violence actually it's different than the violence that the other internet users face, and that push them to practice self-censorship. That's what we have seen with a lot of women journalists who have been reporting on the issue of COVID in Pakistan.
Thank you so much, Nighat, for talking about the gendered and sexualized forms of violence that women are facing in Pakistan. I will now move on to Nikhil. Nikhil, the mission of your organization, MEDIANAMA, is, and I quote here, to help build a digital ecosystem which is open, fair, competitive, and global. And you've fought and won battles against authoritarian government digital policies, which a lot of our panelists have been talking about for the last few minutes. So what are some of the challenges that you have seen emerge from a surveillance perspective in India during the pandemic? If you could talk about that.
So look, I really think that what's happened during the pandemic cannot also be separated from the general direction that security and surveillance are taking, globally. You can't exclude the geopolitics of technology and the way it's shaping up. What the Trump presidency has done in the US, and especially the disinformation campaign from Russia that preceded it, is that it's created a geopolitical uncertainty around safety and security of data and concerns about the dependence of a country's digital economy, especially on multinational companies, whether they're from the US or from China. In particular, what Trump did when the Android security updates were halted for Huawei, seriously damaged the global nature of the internet. And typically, when it comes to security, there are two considerations that governments look at, or that are tricky for in case of cyber attacks, but also in case of data. One is of jurisdiction over data, and the other is around attribution of attacks. And what we've seen is that this global environment has been accelerated by the pandemic, especially in terms of data collection, more data localization, more surveillance of that data, more restrictions on cross-border data flows. And of course, a lot of this has also been previously impacted by the Snowden revelations, which brought in concerns about extraterritorial surveillance, especially from the US. During this last year, let's not forget that India has actually banned over 200 Chinese apps, some of it and as a response to a face-off between the two armies across the line of actual control. But also, this has fueled an increase in tech nationalism and sort of a national determinism, which is leading to, in a sense, surveillance nationalism, just to take from surveillance capitalism as well, because governments don't have any restrictions on access to data. So some moves that have been made over the last year, just from a pure surveillance perspective, especially around contact tracing in India, where I think hundreds of millions of users, citizens, their data has been collected. And we found a month or two ago that, even the security and safety protocols which the government had announced, they're not being followed. And this is health data, this is personal location data, and the mandating of contact tracing in various parts has actually led to, people having that app and the contact tracing app in India, which is called Arogya Setu, but the security protocols announced by the government aren't even being followed by the government. And this we only got through a right to information request, which someone had to fight because the government was initially refusing to answer it. What's very worrying for me is that the pandemic has, in a way, justified facial recognition without there being a data protection bill or even any regulations governing facial recognition in India. So, just a few weeks ago, someone was stopped by the Chennai police while they were conducting vehicle checks at a toll booth at 1 a.m. and they scanned his face with a smartphone app. We're seeing police departments across the country show how, basically put up pictures of policemen holding tablets to people's faces and scanning their faces. So just that bid to reduce contact for authentication is almost leading to stop and search without any provocation, just because they have. I mean, Chennai police, for example, has about 200 policemen have this app on their phone. The other worrying thing, and just to take off from this, what Shankar had said about Aadhaar, is that biometric digital IDs are becoming the norm. And then these databases are getting connected together, and we're seeing the buildup of some 360-degree profiling of individuals, of citizens. And then what's happening is there's a new health ID which is on its way, which is probably going to have more health data connected to it. That again leaves scope for health surveillance. But even when it comes to the vaccine, we found a couple of days ago that in the state of Haryana, the state is issuing new cards or new IDs for families, and they intend to use that for delivering the COVID vaccine when it does happen. But in the process, they're collecting all sorts of data about families, including their national ID Aadhaar information, which they don't necessarily have the authorization to do. In fact, Nandan Nilekani, the person who created Aadhaar, has called for using Aadhaar for delivering the COVID vaccine, which is, so, just the scope of identities and the databases that get collected and connected is increasing rapidly. We're also seeing deployment of drones, and quite extensively. So during the lockdown that happened in India, you had drones being deployed by the police without any authorization, which is required from the central government. And there were drones with loudspeakers that would basically warn people about being outdoors or not maintaining social distancing. But you're also seeing that, there are protests taking place in India at this point in time. Farmers are protesting the farm bill. And there are drones that are being used by the police to scan them. And those permissions are also not public. So what's happening is that geopolitical insecurity that was created by the Trump administration has made countries conscious of data, where it's stored their own deployment of technology versus multinational deployment of technology and multinational connecting of data. And so the state itself is becoming more and more attuned towards surveillance, more open to surveillance, and trying to become a data collector to counter data collection, apart from pushing back against them. So this is a worrying trend that I'm seeing right now.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Nikhil. It's very worrying that, at this time when people are feeling so insecure about the whole pandemic, that contact tracing and other things that are related to the health of people is being used against them. So this basically says a lot about how basically surveillance capitalism and, as you said, surveillance nationalism. I just want to check if we have any questions from the audience. I don't see any questions. I don't know if I'm looking at the right chat box. I think I am. Okay, I don't see any questions yet, but maybe they'll... Okay, thank you, Tenzin. No questions yet. Okay, fine. I think I'll then move on to the second round. And so we've been until now talking about surveillance and authoritarian governments and states and how these impact specific communities during a pandemic. But now I'd like to know from our panelists a little bit about how citizens groups have been fighting against this form of authoritarianism. If we could all speak for a couple of minutes about that. I'll first go on to Shankar, actually. And Shankar, can you talk a little bit about how can digital spaces be made more accessible and fair and more community-centric?
Yeah, sure, Hannah. And thanks for all those great comments. I'm actually tempted to respond to all of them because they all resonate with some of my experience as well. And particularly what you were talking about, Nikhil, with the individual battles around technologies like facial recognition, technologies like drones, right? This breakdown of de facto silos between local and state surveillance, between military and criminal justice and immigration surveillance, right? All of these things are things that we've seen here in the US. And I think I would say the single best thing that's really worked for us is investing in the leadership of communities that have been most impacted by technology, and particularly communities that have been historically marginalized, right, in the conversation around technology. When I started out my career as a tech lawyer, but came back to the space much later and realized that some of the same challenges and blind spots that we previously had around community needs and understanding from a community's perspective how all of these historic inequities connect directly to the moment we're in, with the misuse of data and information to, again, directly impact those communities. And what I found was a very small investment in the leadership capacity and also the sort of technical capacity of those communities to engage with this conversation actually paid huge dividends. For example, in the passage and strengthening of the Seattle Surveillance Ordinance that I mentioned, which has since become a model for algorithmic accountability bills all over this country, the US. That same coalition has also successfully pushed back on the adoption of facial recognition technology, even though Microsoft and Amazon, two companies that sell these products directly to law enforcement, are actually headquartered right here in Seattle. We were able to go and speak with senior leadership in those companies, and also with the policymakers who have largely thus far created a Wild West environment where, as you say, Nikhil, these agencies are just adopting these technologies and putting them out there. We've actually been able to push proactively to have frameworks that require that before you adopt surveillance technologies, you have to have actual rules that are subject to public transparency and essentially to public approval, right? So those kinds of mechanisms can actually give communities some leg into this discussion, especially when you then invest in their capacity. And the work I'm doing now is actually aimed at amplifying that work and ensuring that actually tech company resourcing can help support that capacity building within community leadership and amplify those voices.
So much, Shankar. And we actually have a question here, so I'm just going to take that before I move on. The question is from Moon Ching Yap, and they ask, my company has implemented a facial recognition system. I don't want to provide my image, but they are soon making it compulsory. Do you have these issues in your countries? What do your laws provide for now? I wonder if either Sara or Nikhil wants to take up that question.
I'm happy to pass that over to Nikhil.
Nikhil, you're muted.
Sorry, I have a habit of going on mute.
Sorry.
Munching, in India, we don't have any laws on facial recognition, but there is a need for a law, which is at least according to our right to privacy judgment. But there is some amount of pushback. There was a thought process that with the pandemic, because everyone's going to be wearing masks, it's going to be difficult for facial recognition to flourish, but it doesn't look like it has stopped the deployment of this. And the trickiest part is around the private spaces and it's, you might be required as a part of your employment to share certain information. And fundamentally, the question is, what's the difference between providing a fingerprint for a scan versus providing your face for a scan? And the problem with facial recognition is that both are essentially irreversible. It's like having a permanent username and a permanent password. And once that gets compromised, then that can be used. So I think in California, there is, in multiple cities, I think have banned police users of facial recognition. But I haven't heard anything from an employment perspective. In India, you've got airports, and I think even in the US and airports, facial recognition systems are being put in, but your users are being given a choice, of using other methods apart from facial recognition. But honestly, the way things are headed, I think it will become mandatory everywhere. I don't know, but maybe some of the lawyers might have views on this in terms of whether citizens have rights or employees have rights to prevent this kind of surveillance from their employers.
Thank you, Nikhil. I think we have another question which might also go to you. It is from Ruhi Naz. The question is, given the situation that now citizens almost all the datas are in governments and to many extent in private companies' possession, I want to know how India is experiencing on data privacy law. Do you have any data privacy law? If so, then how far is it effective?
So we almost have a data privacy law. It's currently being discussed by a committee in Parliament. Amongst the things that it mandates, it's only applicable to private companies and not to government surveillance, unfortunately. But what it will do is it will give citizens the right to go to court in case of any violation of the law. Right now, there is none. In terms of, I think in terms of private companies collecting data, and I think Facebook is everyone's favorite example, the GDPR has been fantastic. I really want to see the citizens or people having the right to delete their data, because that's possibly the most empowering right that they can have. Data collection is almost like there's a market failure globally in data collection, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to resolve those issues. But there are concepts of informed consent, of purpose limitation, and data deletion, which will empower us in terms of the data that private companies collect about us.
Thank you, Nikhil. And there's another question, actually. And I think maybe Shankar might want to take this up. How do we, this is from Savera Veerasinghe. How do we establish ethics around using data, especially in crowdsourced platforms and citizen science platforms? How do communities learn of their digital rights, and how do they establish and safeguard them?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Savera. I've actually been involved myself in several efforts to essentially put together community-sourced ethical frameworks around these collective data projects of the kind that you mentioned. And, I think it is of a kind with the work that I mentioned before, right? I see this work as essentially being iterative, because every time you engage a set of diverse communities in the effort to actually understand what restrictions are important to them in terms of the use of their data, that both increases their capacity to have the conversation the next time around and have it better, but it actually also changes the entities that they're engaging with, right? So in this instance, in the last instance where I did this, it was a large private foundation that was connected to a large tech company, right, that was essentially doing these sort of global projects around incarceration and criminal justice systems as well as housing. And they ended up, I think, getting a really good read on these community source ethical frameworks, and actually ended up realizing that they were not even asking the right questions to start out with, right? So I think that space of engagement, which we have so little of right now, and that space of capacity building will help us create those frameworks. And if I may, just a quick word on the previous discussion on data privacy laws. We're still struggling here in the US as well, right? And while I appreciate GDPR as well, having kind of been engaging with some of the debate around that, I think, you have questions about how you actually enforce that look very different from a more decentralized system like the one that the US has. And here, I think some states, including Washington State, have really tried to take the lead in establishing consumer agency over data that starts at the collection point and follows the data downstream through its entire life cycle. So, in my view, that kind of agency over data that goes beyond just deleting it, but actually, having some say over what the company actually does with it, right, and what it fuels in terms of its impact on the life of that consumer is where I think I would love to see our state go, and then the U.S. national laws will hopefully follow. And I think that same debate is happening in Europe and to some extent in India as well.
Thank you so much, Shankar. I think I'll come back to Nighat now because we were talking about citizens' responses to harassment and harassment online. So, Nighat, if you could talk a little bit about how citizens have been using digital spaces to fight back against these forms of harassment that you talked about in the previous round, and what kind of challenges do you see here? If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I already mentioned the forms of violence that usually marginalized and vulnerable communities face in the online spaces. There is a context involved here. So, like coming from a Pakistani society, it's a deep patriarchal, male-dominating society. So usually what we see in the online space when the discrimination against women or trans community or marginalized people or religious minorities, it's usually the same patriarchal offline mindset that reflects in the online space as well. During COVID, what we have seen, I would also like to touch upon a little bit on how government sees COVID as an opportunity to introduce new laws and rules and directives to regulate the internet instead of addressing the issues of people who were actually facing in the online spaces or having difficulty or challenges to access digital spaces during COVID. That we saw that there were, Nikhil already mentioned about banning and blocking of apps in India. Similarly, the same thing happened in Pakistan. So the kind of blocking and the way government blocked different apps during COVID, I haven't seen this much number in previous years. In just few months, they banned dating apps, they banned gaming apps, and they also introduced rules that basically initially they used to call it online harms rules, but now they call it removal and blocking of illegal content. And also they have added safeguard in the title. So that's not a new piece of law, but it's a part of the Parent Act, which is the cybercrime law in Pakistan. Under those rules, they are introducing a lot of new things and giving themselves a lot of powers, the regulatory body, to ban any content that they deem that is illegal in Pakistan. And so it's interesting to see on one hand, citizens, civil society organizations, digital rights organizations, civil society organizations are trying to catch up with the digital space during COVID and, deal with the pandemic on another hand, but and then they have to, push back against these rules and against these laws that are being introduced during COVID. So, we cannot go into the consultations due to the SOPs. We can only take part online, but we can take part online when we are invited. At first place, we are not even invited. So I guess I feel that governments have seen this as an opportunity, but there is a resistance that I'm also witnessing in terms of back. Organizations are pushing back and have issued statements, going online, going on TV, talking to people, and making an argument in a layman's language. So, which actually goes back to Savera's question, where she says that how communities know about their digital rights, and I think it's very important for people like us to make our language accessible for laymen, because what I see in my experience in Pakistan, it seems that we are talking to ourselves and just like small group of people, and when and we cannot make a language accessible to let the larger communities or the internet users know that how certain draconian and problematic things will impact their lives or their rights in the online space.
Thank you so much, Nighat. I was going to ask Sara a question.
I just wanted to quickly add to something.
Yes, of course, Nikhil, go ahead.
Just the word communities reminded me that there's something interesting that's happening in India, and it's also begun now in Europe around something called non-personal data. So our government basically created a group that came out with a report that suggested that while personal data is the fiduciary right of an individual, there's something called community data or non-personal data, which is what they're saying is anything from which personal information, identifiable information has been removed. So they're saying that can be accessible to the government and other private parties. And I just wanted to point out that this creates a scope for additional surveillance because re-identification is so easily possible in the digital age. Sorry, I just remember from the word community. I just thought I'd throw this in as well.
Of course. Thank you so much, Nikhil, for adding that. We had lost Sara. Now I think we have her back. So, yeah. So I will pose a question to Sara now. So talking about regulations or protections, are there regulations or protections for individuals against cyber harassment, cyber stalking, online mobbing, etc.? These regulations in Bangladesh, do you think they are adequate? And does effective protection require further draconian laws, which has happened in the case of Bangladesh? And if you could talk a little bit about how citizens' campaigns have played out in Bangladesh against these kinds of laws.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I really have been hopping in and hopping off this platform. I think there is a call for more draconian laws. The first point is the Digital Insecurity Act. We have that. We have the Pornography Control Act. And we have, of course, ordinary criminal laws that are also usable. Interestingly, there are definitely gaps in the Digital Security Act and the other legislation in terms of dealing with some of the particular manifestations of cyber harassment and cyberbullying, and it's not clear that the law completely covers that. And interestingly, of the many, many cases that are pending at the Cyber Tribunal, the vast majority are not dealing with cyber violence and harassment of women, for example, but dealing with those cases I mentioned of hurting the image of the nation or hurting religious sentiment, those kinds of allegations. So on the one hand, there is a demand for more law, but I think the kind of more cogent demand is for not only better implementation of the law, but also maybe for tech responses and other responses that don't require calling in the law enforcement authorities for the reasons I explained before in terms of, very arbitrary application of the law. But another concern that many people have raised, particularly young women activists, is that for many young women who face harassment online, they wouldn't know where to go, and they also wouldn't be able to go and get legal support without getting parental support first or parental consent first, and they don't feel able to handle the whole paraphernalia of getting a legal response, and it's not particularly swift or effective. So I think there's a big question about what we can do. And in terms of how people are taking up these, oh God, I've got to go into court. Sorry. This is very awkward. I'm just going to jump off in 1 second. Sorry. So the way people are organizing around it, I think, one is, of course, building a critique of what has been the impact, what kind of cyberbullying is happening, what kind of cyber harassment is happening. There's a kind of mobbing and all of that kind of stuff. Trying to analyze who's doing it. Are there patterns? Can you see, for example, is it more religious extremist groups? Is it particular kind of political groups? Is there a common agenda on that? The difficulty is, as I said before, there isn't really effective legal accountability for some of these groups, unfortunately. So you have to respond through organizing and through exposure. One of the positive things has been, we just had a very interesting dialogue yesterday with the Facebook country team, moderated through Bangladesh's the world's largest development organization, BRAC, where people were speaking together about what their concerns are and seeing how they can build processes, for example, build on outreach processes so that people can have more understanding of how they can actually respond to this kind of harassment. There were also women's groups involved talking about how they're doing programs around understanding what consent means and what digital consent means and what happens when you're in digital space and what are the kinds of risks and threats that you have. So I think it's really a conversation not only about what's happening in online space, but how we connect it to the offline and how we connect it to the age-old stuff about how do we organize better, how do we understand better what our risks and threats are, and how do we figure out who our allies are. Some of these are unconventional allies. It's not enough for us to be together as human rights organizations or activists or lawyers or journalists even. I think we have to make alliances with tech providers. We have to talk with the people who run the platforms, and we have to see how these understandings can be communicated about exactly what we face. A very small example to end with, language issues has been a big thing. Just a few years ago, we saw how threats that were coming through in Bangla, for example, to groups working around sexual rights, this just wouldn't even figure on the radar of, for example, Facebook. They didn't even get that this kind of threat was going on. Whereas now there are systems for trying to understand in different languages what's going on, and we have a much quicker response mechanism. It's nowhere near good enough. There are still massive numbers of threats going on. But I think using these spaces to create the response is, I think, a more effective way than just looking at legal responses, but we still need to have the recognition of privacy, consent, these other issues well embedded, and I think people are carrying on working on how to do that. I'm going to jump off because I have to get into we're about to finish anyway.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, Sara. Yeah, we will lose you now, but thank you for that very interesting talk about harassment. And how people are dealing with it and other issues related to it. So I don't think we have any more questions from the audience. So we're kind of at the close, but I just wanted to get like a minute's kind of a closing statement from all of you, maybe the way forward or something like that, anything that you think is important. So just 1 minute from all of you, maybe starting with Nighat.
I think we have discussed a lot of issues, but I also feel that if we want to really see a difference in an ecosystem, like all stakeholders need to work together, but at the same time, they need to be educated about the issues also. So, like going to the IT ministry or any stakeholder who doesn't really understand how internet governance space works, it's actually useless to, meet with them again and again, talk about the issues. At the same time, I think holding tech giants accountable, what they are doing in your country and how they are speaking to the governments. So I think that's also very important, because most of the time they stand with you when you resist against rules and regulations and laws, but behind the doors they are also talking to the government, which are not really transparent, and we don't know what kind of negotiations are happening. But at the same time, I think we also need to be very cautious when we demand laws to deal with the online harassment or cybercrimes issues, because we have seen these laws that are made in the name of protecting young women and girls against cyber harassment often being misused and weaponized against marginalized people.
So much, Nighat. Shankar, last comment.
Yeah, I guess I would emphasize as well, over the last few years, here in the US in this tech space, I think we've seen a lot of things, we've really seen the debate change quite a lot. And I think that's been the result of a really sustained investment, both in the capacity of communities to engage, but also there's been a parallel process of education with policymakers and regulators as well, right? I think 4 or 5 years ago, a lot of these lawmakers, couldn't ask a straight question about the internet, right? They didn't know security from privacy, from algorithmic accountability, and most of them actually still don't, but some of them at least do now, right? And even, 2 years ago, you had the Facebook hearings where the questions were really not particularly sharp, coming to now where we have, a lot more sharpness and conciseness and actual meaningful regulatory initiatives like antitrust, which I think have really been the result of a lot of people making a concerted effort, right? And a lot of different organizations organizing to educate those policymakers and regulators. So I think this is really a ground up effort, right? Which starts, I think, as everybody sort of touched on, with having a broader set of communities, and particularly marginalized and impacted communities, being able to engage with this space and articulate, what it is they want in different ways, and regulators and lawmakers actually having the capacity to understand what that means.
Thank you so much, Shankar. Nikhil, do you have a last comment for us, please?
Sure, Hannah, thanks. And I'm just going to look at action points, saying that, what are the things that we ought to do moving forward, or be conscious of moving forward. For me, the thing is that one needs to watch out and push back against any reduction in agency and freedoms using technology, because the technology that once empowered us, and this is the internet that we've grown with, we've grown up with. That same tools can be used against us. So we need to be conscious about what's reducing our agency and our freedoms versus what's enhancing them. Secondly, it's really important to build capacity amongst individual citizens, and citizens need to be more active. So the idea of active citizenship is more important, because they need to participate in the process of policy making. Democracy doesn't end with elections. And I think policy making happens through the year, and it's happening at a far more rapid pace than ever before. The third thing is that, it's really important to push back against systemic changes that are being made using technology platforms and systems that are being put in by the government, by policymakers. So looking at laws, looking at tech infrastructure, government infrastructure, GovTech, that's extremely important. And number 4, how to do this is to push for transparency and accountability and alignment with not just every nation's fundamental rights, but international human rights. Human rights need to be at the center of ensuring safety and security on the internet.
Thank you so much, Nikhil. And I want to thank all of you, Nikhil, Nighat, Shankar, and Sara, for bringing up such important issues, and especially at a time when we are all, going through certain things together. and where our presence on online spaces have increased so much. But these issues of privacy, surveillance, and security are so important to think about. And I'm sure you've given the audience here many things to think about. Thank you so much for coming to this panel today. And I also want to thank Asia Society and especially Sanjeev and Tenzin for their endless support in organizing this panel. Thank you so much, and good night, and hope everyone has a good day.
Thank you.